First of all, hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the March edition of our Blue Summit webinar series. My name is Derek Beck, and I'm logging in from Augusta, Georgia. A little bit about myself. I've spent almost 30 years in the fields of project and program management, organizational change leadership, and leadership development. And over the years, I've had the pleasure to work with government agencies, military organizations, and private companies of all different sizes in a wide variety of industries. I've also served as a volunteer on the board of directors for my local PMI chapter, the PMI Augusta-Aiken chapter. I was the president of Agile Augusta for a year, and then I have also presented several keynotes on project leadership and AI topics to various organizations and PMI chapters from around the country. I'm also the founder and CEO of Blue Summit Consulting Group. Can I go by Blue Summit now? But we're a service-disabled veteran-owned small business providing certification prep and workforce development services. We specialize mostly in the technical and soft skills that are needed to be successful in project management. All right, so today's topic is addressing why people resist change. Along the way, we're going to talk about not just some of the things that drive that resistance from people, but we'll also provide some things to consider for helping to better work through it so that you can improve your chances of success and leading change. I also feel like this is a pretty timely topic, actually, because we're all in the middle of some pretty significant change around the world. We have artificial intelligence that is transforming entire industries. National infrastructures are beginning to evolve and modernize fairly rapidly. And geopolitical shifts are reshaping the markets in which we compete. As a result, organizations are continuing to be forced to adapt faster than ever to maintain competitive advantages, and studies show that as much as 75% of transformation efforts are still failing. This number's been around for quite a while. And I believe that's because organizational change or transformation is not just about strategies and implementing project plans, although that's exactly how I always thought of it before, right? Like if I know what my current state is or what I want my future state to be, then I should just be able to plan and implement a bunch of projects to get me there, right? But what I've learned is that change is more about people. And people are going to respond to change positively or negatively based on a wide variety of factors. And resistance is probably one of the most challenging obstacles you're going to face as a change leader. So today, we're going to break down some of the psychology behind why people change. Hold on a second. Sorry. So we're going to say we're going to break down some of the psychology behind why people change and why people push back against change and how we as leaders can work through it rather than fight against it. And this is a common question. Well, not really a question, I guess, but more like a statement that I typically see when we talk about this topic, is that a lot of people think that that's just their natural disposition. They just resist the change. So that's a common belief, that we just automatically do that as a natural instinct. But I don't think that's entirely true. Because people embrace change all the time. Like when they get a new job, buy a new home, upgrade to a new technology. Adapting to change and being resilient is exactly how we survived for so long as a species. So I don't think we resist change itself exactly. I think the positive and negative reactions to change are really depending on three key elements. We have process, context, and experience. And I'm going to go through each of these a little bit. We're going to tackle these in a bunch of different ways. But by process, I mean that every person, individually and as a group, has to go through a process of change to make change stick for the long haul. Just like we have processes to get through grief or addiction, we also have processes to get through change. For example, John Connor's 8-stage framework for organizational change that he outlined in his book, Leading Change, gives an excellent structure for large groups and organizations to pass through to more successfully navigate the complexities of change. And from identifying the need for change to achieving some quick wins to gain momentum, to emphasizing repetition for long-term habit building. And ProSize ADKAR process, ProSize, a change management organization, they do a lot of studies on change management all throughout the world, and they even have certifications in organizational change that I think is also very valuable to get if you ever get the opportunity to do it. But ProSize ADKAR process is very similar to John Kotter's 8-stage framework, but ADKAR is a framework that helps us understand the process that individuals will have to go through to navigate change, from identifying the need for change to wanting to change, all the way to habit building. And I'm going to talk more about ADKAR in a little bit because it's incredibly important to us for working with people and working through that change resistance that we tend to experience. But for now, I really just want to drive home the fact that people need to walk through specific steps or phases to get to the point where change is not only successful, but it sticks around for the long haul. It becomes part of your DNA, right? And so it's not just a personality-driven event. The context of change that people are involved in, or the context of the situation that people are involved in, will also determine how people will respond. And not just actual context, but also how the human brain is perceiving that context, right? Everyone's in a different place financially, in their relationships, self-confidence, mental health otherwise, right? In all kinds of different situations, and everything is unique to that individual. So we can't just make assumptions about entire groups of people, right? We have to kind of treat this on a very individual basis. And so some aspects of change may feel exciting because it brings on expectations of gains or rewards, but others may feel very threatening because of the perceptions of loss, as an example. And of course, perception is also heavily influenced by past experiences. Does an individual or organization's experience with change in the past come with positive memories of success, or has their experience been filled with nothing but confusion, chaos, organizational failure? You know, even those things I mentioned before about the types of changes people typically embrace, they can still elicit negative responses or produce anxiety if past experiences have been exceptionally bad or traumatic. And so to answer the original question, do people inherently resist change? I would say that no, people don't naturally resist change because we know that people exist who embrace changes every day. But when change is unexpected or it's unwanted, it can be pretty jarring and it can feel as if it's being imposed. And when change feels imposed, our brains will think that our survival is under attack and will respond accordingly. It's just how our brains are wired. So frameworks like John Kotter's 8-stage framework and ProSize ADKAR help us understand the process. Like I said, I'm going to get into ADKAR a little bit more in the next section here. But to help us understand how we perceive context, we could turn to a different model, one built by David Rock called the SCARF model. David Rock is a world-renowned business leadership consultant and neuroscientist. There's got a lot of great information out there on YouTube. You can check out for free. But he founded a whole new field of study called neuroleadership, which combines leadership and organizational development theory with modern research on how the human brain functions. So modern brain science, right? Neuroscience. And during his own research, David Rock formed what is known as the SCARF model. It provides us with that neuroscience-based framework that helps us better understand human responses to change. Now, SCARF itself is an acronym that identifies 5 key social drivers that influence human reactions and motivations, particularly in situations where we perceive threats or rewards. And these drivers help explain why change can trigger things like resistance, and how leaders can then structure their approaches to minimize negative reactions, or at least work through them. And so what SCARF stands for is what you see on the screen now, right? So we'll start with the S. The S in SCARF stands for status, and status refers to an individual's feeling of relative importance within a group. As status increases, people are happier. When status decreases, even when there is just a perception of a decrease or loss of status or a fear of potential loss in the future, the brain will trigger a threat response. Think of like fight, flight, or freeze type responses. Okay, now status can mean a lot of things too. I think it's important to kind of expand on this a little bit. So status is whatever that feeling is of being able to provide input. Maybe it's respect or being treated like an expert, right? Maybe it's a rank, like if you're in the military or something, okay? Something like that. C stands for certainty. Unpredictability creates stress because the brain is hardwired to seek for patterns and stability to navigate the chaos of daily life. This is because that neocortex, the big part of our brain that we all think of when we think of the picture of the brain, it does all the heavy analytical processing and it's extremely resource intensive. So when certainty is disrupted, the brain starts to freak out a little bit because it's starting to take on more duties, right? It's very, very resource intensive to sift through all the data that's being pushed to it, right? And when that gets to be too much, the neocortex can shut down. And then it's just a bunch of instinctual responses from the body, right? And so when certainty is disrupted, except that brain freaks out and then activates the threat response as a result. When we get to the A, that stands for autonomy. Which refers to the sense of control people will have over their environments and decisions. And this is an interesting one because it's the only one where too much of a good thing is actually a bad thing, right? People want to be able to make their own decisions and everything. Where humans are very much lone wolves in this way. But humans also want guidance and leadership and a path to belong to, right? So you can't get too autonomous. Otherwise, we start to feel lost in the sauce. And I'll talk about that a little more. But when teams and individuals feel like they lack choice in the process, like being told how they're going to work versus being able to choose their own way of working, or at least be able to influence or provide input into the way of working that they're going to have to adopt, then again, the brain perceives a threat, potentially triggering resistant behaviors. Now we get into the R in SCARF, and R stands for relatedness, which refers to our natural need to feel connected and included within a group. I said humans are lone wolves, but we're also very complex social beings. And we often see ourselves as independent, yet we deeply rely on those social bonds for security and identity. That's going to come up again in a little bit. All right. From an evolutionary standpoint, being part of a group increases our chance of survival. And this wiring still influences how we interact today. So psychologically, as part of our survival instinct, the brain categorizes people into in-group and out-group members. And that's a process that's known as social categorization. So when change disrupts established relationships or team dynamics, people might fear that shift from the in-group out to an out-group, which can trigger the threat response in the brain. And they're not necessarily fighting the change itself, right? Really what's happening is that they're acting in that way because they fear losing their sense of belonging, trust, or influence within their current social circles or their perceived future social circle. And then the F in the SCARF, that stands for fairness. And that refers to the brain's sensitivity to whether processes and decisions are perceived as equitable. When people feel that change is being implemented unfairly, whether through inconsistent policies, real or perceived favoritism, or a lack of transparency, it triggers a strong threat response, which not only induces the resistance, but it can also even lead to disengagement entirely. One interesting, though, is that neuroscience research shows that perceptions of fairness activate the brain's reward system, the same regions that get us excited and where we develop positive emotions, while perceived unfairness will activate the same brain regions as physical pain and negative emotions, right? Which is what makes fairness an incredibly critical factor in our change management efforts. All right, moving through this pretty quick. But now that we've covered context, let's talk about how people experience change. There have been a lot of studies on this from organizations like ProSci and Gartner and PricewaterhouseCoopers that provide some really interesting insights into the experiential factors that drive resistance to change. And when we look at them within the context of that SCARF model, it all, to me anyway, really starts to kind of make some sense. The most common factor that shows up at the top of the list is a lack of trust in leadership. A study from Gartner showed that organizations with high trust levels have up to 2.6 times greater change capacity than those with low trust. This is because when people lose trust in their leadership, or when people do trust in leadership, they're more willing to take on risks and they're significantly more resilient. They're willing to experiment a lot more. Studies also show that high trust organizations experience greater collaboration, higher engagement, and a stronger sense of psychological safety. And if you take any of our courses, we really stress the importance of building environments and psychological safety and trust in the workplace. And I'll even repeat that several times here, probably throughout the remainder of this presentation. Other experiential factors that typically top the list, and this is not going to be in any specific order here, but fear of the unknown and loss of control. This triggers our desire for status and certainty, and it raises questions for autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Another factor that shows up on the studies is perceived loss in general and habit destruction. So think about the feeling of the loss of status. The human brain is hardwired to react more intensely to a loss or even perceptions of loss or potential loss in the future than we do for rewards or gains. And it's an important survival instinct for us, really. And our brains love patterns, like I was saying before, so habits are good for us in so many ways. But it can also cause us to be more resistant to changing our ways, especially the more entrenched we are in our own processes. And entrenched processes is one of the barriers that shows, when people, when they do surveys, when ProSci, for example, does a survey, that entrenched processes is a barrier to change that gets reported on quite often. Cultural and organizational barriers. So organizational culture is established through a series of hundreds or thousands of individual daily micro decisions that influence relationships and processes. If an organization hasn't built a culture of psychological safety and trust, then leading change can be incredibly difficult, if not entirely impossible. Organizational barriers can also range from hierarchical structures that limit effective communication to resource constraints like insufficient funding or staff, which can make the change seem impractical and will also cause people to maybe give up, which feels like resistance. Lack of buy-in from key stakeholders. So one Gartner study showed that the number one cause of change failures was the lack of buy-in from frontline supervisors. Pretty interesting. And studies from ProSci indicate that the lack of strong support from senior leadership is a major predictor of project failure. So what we need is good information. We need to make sure frontline supervisors are on board with the change effort, right? And what we also need is senior leaders to take ownership and display their commitment from the top down and lead by example. Remember that and bring that up here again a little bit. All right. And last one I wanted to bring up here for this section was change fatigue. Change fatigue happens when employees are exposed to continuous, overlapping, or poorly managed change initiatives, leaving them overwhelmed and exhausted. When people experience too many changes in rapid succession without adequate time to adapt, they can become resistant as a self-protective measure. It's no wonder then that a ProSci study found that middle managers are the group that is most resistant to change. But I want to stop there for a second and just do a quick recall on that. So we have a critical element where we need senior leadership involved from the top. They have to be visible, and they have to show strong support and commitment to the change initiative. We have middle managers that'll be the category of people that are going to give you the biggest problems, right? And then we have the frontline supervisors that you have to get to through the middle managers, typically, and you have to get them to buy into the change. All right, so this type of, just remember that. So this type of exhaustion diminishes employees' motivation, right, and the capacity to engage with new changes. As a result, change fatigue leads to widespread disengagement, cynicism, and resistant behavior, and even makes future efforts more challenging to implement successfully. That's why good change management, increasing your chances of success, are important here. In fact, Gardner's research found that employees' willingness to support organizational change has dropped from 74% in 2016 to just 43% in 2022. So what can we do to work through resistance? Well, one of the first things you can do as a change leader is to evaluate where in the change process each stakeholder or stakeholder group is. And for this, you can rely on that ProSci ADKAR model. And ADKAR is also an acronym which stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and repetition. Sometimes you'll see reinforcement there in the R. Same thing, really. Okay? The A, awareness, this is about, do people know why the change is happening in the first place? Do they understand the need for change? Do they see it? If not, start there. A lot of times, people are very comfortable where they're at in the status quo. They don't see the need. If you're working for a company that's multi-billion-dollar a year business, right? People are thinking, we made $40 billion last year. What needs to be fixed? We're doing pretty darn good. But leadership might see other issues. And so they see that need to change, and other people don't. And it's up to them then to start, communicating and selling that need, right? So people have to be able to see it first. If they see the need for change, the second hurdle you have to get people through is the D, desire. Do people want to change? What's in it for them? Right? So the next hurdle after that is the knowledge hurdle. Okay. So they see the need for change. They want to make the change. Do they know how to change? That's really important. This is where establishing good training program comes in. And so when you make your change management plan, say like maybe you're a project manager and you're running an organizational change effort as your project, part of that project plan, it's not just how are we going to report deliverables and, do outs, and how are we going to meet with the team, and what are we going to do the status meetings with senior management. You also need to put on the calendar a training plan and a rollout plan, right, on how this change is going to spread across the organization. And then that training, say, for example, if you're implementing a new software or a new technical capability, think like artificial intelligence, right, tools, then, you probably need to have some training established to teach people how to use this stuff. All right, after knowing how to change, then it's the ability. Do they have the ability to apply the knowledge that they gained or they have about this change, whatever it may be? Okay. So maybe you can implement some practical exercises. Maybe you can drill, or maybe it's just giving people an opportunity to put it into practice and give guidance on how to do the things. And this is important, right? Because I was part of one organization. I went through Lean Six Sigma training, went all the way through Black Belt. And I walk away with all these great ideas in my head about how, I'm going to change all these things and fix all these things. And we're going to start running projects in a different way. And we're going to improve all these processes. But knowing about it and knowing what to do is a whole lot different than getting in that office and putting it into practice, right? And that's what I experienced too. And so, that just takes time, right? Takes time, but also you need to be able to put people in real world scenarios and give them the opportunity to work it and learn. And then the last one is reinforcement. So if you can get them, if they have the ability, then it's just a matter of repetition. How do we make it stick, right? Emphasize repetition, reward people for their efforts at this point. It's about building confidence and developing new habits at that stage. So the way you use this is you make sure that you take enough time in the early stages of the transformation effort to do a thorough stakeholder analysis and identify which stage in the ADKAR process is putting up the biggest barrier to progress for each stakeholder or stakeholder group. We can lump them as a stakeholder group if they're all pretty similar, okay? And then you can use a SCARF model to assess how the environmental factors of the transformation effort might be impacting them as well. So combined, I feel like SCARF and ADKAR are two incredibly powerful frameworks for us to utilize as change leaders. So, all right. After the ADKAR model, here are some other things that you can consider again and know, general order of business here. But first, develop a solid communications plan. Studies show that 68% of the senior management knows the actual reason for an organizational change, but this starts to drop pretty significantly to 53% for mid-level managers and 40% for the frontline supervisors. Remember, I was talking about how difficult it is to get down to those frontline supervisors. That's because most people don't have a good communications plan. They think of it more as projects, and they just say, go do the project. Just do it because I told you to do it, all right? But we got to know the why behind a lot of things, okay? And so this information gap or communications gap is a big part of what's impeding success for most transformation outcomes, okay? And another Gartner study showed that 73% of employees experience moderate to high levels of stress due to poor communication or change communication specifically. So be sure to clearly articulate why the change is needed, what is involved, and how it benefits everyone. Keep your communication lines open, keep them honest, and communicate frequently, specifically in order to reduce uncertainty and address the anxiety, right? You don't even tell people what they want in here. You just need to tell people the real, right? The real stuff about why we're doing what we're doing. All right. Get all the brains in the game. This is that inclusivity piece, right? Involve your key stakeholders early and often. This means your project team members too. Include people that are affected by the change in as much of the tactical decision-making as humanly possible. Involving people in planning and implementation both will encourage shared ownership of project activities and the transformation outcome. Even small opportunities for input can help reduce the threat response and increase the engagement that you're looking for. All right, provide support and be visible. Offer training and resources to help individuals adapt. It's okay to acknowledge the challenges they're likely facing during the transition. Strong support and engagement from leadership is a critical success factor in change, like we've mentioned a couple of times. And hopefully you're kind of picking up some of these data points that really highlight this, right, and really calls this out. Unfortunately, in 2013, PricewaterhouseCoopers conducted a survey and found that only 14% of leaders felt personally responsible for change management. Somebody else's problem to lead that, right? But this really underscores the need for leadership commitment in order to be successful. So if you're that person on the top, really take this to heart and know that you have to be in front. You have to be visible and you have to be loud, and you can never talk enough. And if you're the project manager, maybe you're a middle-level manager, and you need to convince those senior leaders that they need to be that for the change effort to succeed. It can't just be you. All right, like I said before, build environments of psychological safety and trust. How do we do that? Well, transparency is always the key, right? Be very transparent with everything. Align the change with organizational core values, strategic direction, those types of things, right? That kind of tells you your why. And fight any us versus them situations that crop up along the way that can lead to outgroup mentality. All right, talked about the in-group and out-group thing, and what gets really bad with the out-group is that the in-group, if they see somebody else as not part of that group, it's really, really hard for that person to be able to influence or get ideas accepted or whatever, and it's going to slowly push them out of the picture to the point where they're completely disengaged and disenfranchised. And that's not what we want, right? Remember, we want to get all the brains in the game. And so fostering an environment of psychological safety and trust is the surest way to get everybody involved. All right. All right. Implement gradually. Eat the elephant in little chunks, so to speak, right? So introduce changes in stages, set clear milestones, and celebrate the successes to make the process less overwhelming. And we do this through thoughtful planning for quick wins. So if you go too long with a win, and I'm sure many of us have probably been involved in situations like, if you go too long without a win, what happens? You get tired. All of you have been through organizational change before, but it's tiring, it's exhausting. It takes a lot of energy to make it work. And if you go too long, there's no end in sight, right? Things just last forever. You'll start to kind of slip away, and you'll start to lose the any momentum that you might have had going into it. And so if you plan for quick wins, then you can get through very specific hurdles in your timeline, and then you got to make that obvious too, and to celebrate those wins and do it in a very public way so people feel like, there's progress, and there's movement forward to some conclusion, right? All right. And finally, last bit of advice I think I can give you in this section here is to handle resistance positively, right? So address resistance with empathy, use positive reinforcement and persuasion rather than coercion to encourage acceptance. We want people to want the change, right? So if we're looking at that, you're going to get that a lot easier. One of the things that we teach in our negotiating and influencing skills course is that labeling emotions through what a guy named Chris Voss calls accusation audits can help bring down emotional barriers. Now, an accusation audit is a phrase that acknowledges negativity in advance. For example, you could say, I know this might feel overwhelming, or I imagine everyone feels a little nervous about the future right now. And then follow it up with your but, right? When you can do that in advance, then people kind of go, yeah, that's right, I do feel that way, right? And I'm not saying you do or that you are this way, right? We're saying things like, I know you might be feeling this way. I imagine, right? So you're not, when you use words like that, you're not coming in direct, right? And so that'll kind of knock down some of those barriers. All right, so facing resistance is very common in every project. It's highly unlikely that you're ever going to be able to avoid the issue entirely, right? So ultimately, the goal should not be to eliminate resistance, but to expect it, understand it, use it as a guide to lead change more effectively. Resistance to change is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that is driven by various emotional, psychological, and cultural factors. And understanding why people resist change is the first step in addressing it effectively. And by recognizing the root causes of that resistance, change and project leaders can become more empathetic and create strategies to support the employees through the transition process. Ultimately, breaking through barriers of resistance is more about changing the way people experience the change rather than try to eliminate the resistance altogether. that experience is the most important thing. All right. I've rambled on for a while. It's just me against the world up here and the camera. So I love to hear from you, though. If you have any thoughts that you want to share on this topic, or if you have any questions about anything that we've covered today, feel free to drop your questions in that chat. And let's go ahead and try to discuss that. I do see one question. And what is the best way to communicate change to reduce resistance? And my answer really there is you there's a couple different ways that you can do this, right? So you identify what the need is, but I think you have to connect it to something important. Maybe you could talk about what would happen if you don't change, for example, right? So, if we don't do this, we're going to go out of business. It's just a fact. We have to change the market realities, right? And sometimes people and things just need to blow up in people's faces sometimes in order for them to see it. And so John Connor in his book, Leading Change, actually calls that manufacturing crisis, right? Where, if anybody was ever in the military, or maybe they've seen this in the workplace, sometimes you get work piled on you so much, but that's on purpose. When it's on purpose, right? Because that person is trying to show you or teach you how to lead through other people, because you get so much work that you can't get it done all by yourself. So you have to learn how to delegate and then over time you have to learn how to trust and that kind of stuff. And so that's one method of, say, manufacturing a crisis. But that's kind of how you have to do that. Would explain the with and the what's in it for me piece too. But yeah, I think probably one of the strongest ones is just, getting people to see what would happen if you just don't do anything. Did that help answer the question? Do it. All right. Anybody else? Okay. I see Karen. So what happens if someone in leadership will not get out of the way? Meaning they're too involved, huh? I think someone in leadership sometimes, you want them to a micromanager. Okay. Thanks for the clarification. Okay, so a micromanager, when I talk to people about how to deal with micromanagers, you want them involved, right? So you don't want to get to the point of saying, get out of the way, don't be involved, especially in this context where we're talking about organizational transformation and whatever. You could push them into a point of being micromanagers, or maybe they're under the gun. And so the only way to deal with a micromanager is to get ahead of them, right? And start thinking about things before they think about them, and to start feeding them the information they need to make them feel more comfortable, right? It's that discomfort and that risk aversion that, in my opinion, causes someone to be a micromanager in the first place. And I have found little to no success in telling somebody, get out of the way, stop being a micromanager. It doesn't work. In fact, it tends to make them worse, right? And so the only real way to work with a micromanager is to get ahead of them, I think, and just start answering their questions in advance before they can think of them. And once you satisfy that leader or that person's concerns, and they know they're going to get it in a timely manner, you start to train them to a degree to not have to feel that, right? It's I don't know if this is a good thing to say or not, but I like rescue dogs and stuff, right? And they're all good. The dogs are good. They're great puppies, but they come with a little bit of distrust sometimes. And so you have to work with them to get to the point where they can trust you. And then they eventually just act like a normal dog, right? Um, so not trying to compare people to dogs, um, but I feel like the mentality, the concept still kind of applies. Yeah, it is a trust building process, but I think that highlights what most people probably are, especially people who might be attending like this webinar, right? Middle managers, frontline supervisors, where we kind of have to exercise that 360-degree leadership, right? You have to lead up, and how you do that is really through answering whoever is up, right? Answer their concerns as much as possible. And then when they're free, because they're not worried about their survival and the things that are important to them because you have it, then they're a lot more open to hear you out too. So that's another way that you can actually influence in your organization and affect change in general, because you have freed the people above you, and they also feel like, hey, you had their back. They're a whole lot more likely to be open to what you have to say and push things for you, right? And put you in the spotlight. Yeah, I don't know if everybody saw it, but Carlos put that he agrees that getting ahead will help build trust and confidence. Yeah, that's been my experience anyway. As far as I've tried both ways, and the most oftentimes it's the leading up piece by, hey, here's what I recommend, but here is why, right? Don't just tell people what you recommend to do or what they should be doing, but explain it. Give them the data, right, to trust you and your opinion on that. And teach them your thought process, right? Sometimes that's how you do it, right? If you need to train people, that's kind of the best way to go. All right, great questions. Anybody else? So, get a couple more seconds here. How are we doing on time? Doing pretty good on time still. All right. Well, be sure to stick around for just a few minutes longer then to get some information on claiming PDUs. So if you're already certified with the Project Management Institute, we're a premier authorized training partner with the Project Management Institute. And so for attending this webinar, you can claim a PDU for this. And so just hang out. I'm going to give you some information that you can use to do that. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, or really any of the things that I've discussed here, you can roll into one of our courses through our website or through North Carolina State University website, specifically in the Project Management Certificate program that we're involved in. Or you can contact us for specialized training for your organization. We can customize stuff for your industry. And don't forget that we hold these webinars on various leadership and management topics the first Thursday of every month from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. Okay, thanks again for joining today. Hopefully this information gave you some ideas on how to be more effective in leading change within your organization. And look forward to seeing you all again soon.